Some family histories arrive in neat, simple labels: English, Irish, Scottish, German. But some of the most important bloodlines in American history refuse to stay inside a single box. They crossed borders too often, survived too many upheavals, and carried too many layered identities for that. And few examples are more misunderstood than the people we call the Scots-Irish, because despite the name, this story does not begin in one place. It begins in a violent frontier zone between England and Scotland, where generations lived with raids, loyalties, feuds, and shifting crowns. It passes through Ulster in the north of Ireland, where political power, religion, land, and colonization reshaped entire communities. And then it moves again, across the Atlantic, into the forests, valleys, and rough backcountry of colonial America, where these same families became some of the most influential settlers of the frontier. This is not just a migration story. It is a story about how border people remain border people even when the map changes, how memory survives movement, how a culture forged by insecurity, faith, mobility, and toughness can travel from one contested landscape to another and leave a lasting mark on a nation. And here is the deeper mystery. Millions of people may carry Scots-Irish ancestry today without fully realizing it, because the identity was often blurred, simplified, or folded into larger labels like Irish, Scottish, or simply American. If you enjoy deeply researched origin stories, frontier history, and the hidden forces that shaped real family bloodlines, subscribe now and stay with this channel, because this story only gets more revealing the farther back we go. To understand who the Scots-Irish were, we have to start in a place where life itself was lived on edge. The borderlands that forged a people. Long before the term Scots-Irish existed, there were the borderlands, that unstable strip of territory between England and Scotland, where authority was often weak, violence was common, and survival depended as much on kinship and reputation as on law. For centuries, this region was not a peaceful national boundary in the modern sense. It was a zone of chronic tension. Families on both sides lived under the threat of raiding, retaliation, livestock theft, political upheaval, and war. In such an environment, identity was shaped less by abstract loyalty to a distant crown and more by immediate realities: family alliances, local defense, riding skill, endurance, and the ability to react fast when trouble came over the ridge. This was the world of the border reivers, families whose names would echo for generations: Armstrong, Graham, Kerr, Elliott, Nixon, Scott, Johnston, and many others. They were not all criminals, and they were not all heroes. They were products of a harsh political landscape. In periods when central authority collapsed or weakened, people adapted. Raiding became normalized. Feuding became structured. Survival became cultural. That world mattered because it taught habits that do not disappear overnight: suspicion of outsiders, fierce loyalty to kin, a hard sense of honor, comfort with movement, practical violence when necessary. These are traits that later writers sometimes romanticized, exaggerated, or turned into stereotype. But behind the myth sits a historical truth. Border societies create resilient, defensive, mobile people. Then came one of the great political turning points in British history. In 1603, the crowns of England and Scotland were united under James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England. This did not erase tension overnight, but it did begin to change the political logic of the borderlands. The old frontier instability that had shaped generations was no longer useful to a centralizing monarchy. The crown wanted order where disorder had long prevailed. That meant some of the old border culture was suppressed, redirected, or displaced. And that displacement matters, because when political systems pacify one frontier, the people shaped by that frontier do not always become quiet farmers overnight. Sometimes they move. Sometimes they are moved. Sometimes they are recruited into a new frontier somewhere else. That is exactly what would happen next. Ulster and the making of a new identity. If the borderlands forged the temperament, Ulster helped forge the identity. In the early 17th century, after conflict and rebellion in Ireland, the English crown supported the plantation of Ulster, a colonial project that settled Protestant populations, many from Scotland and some from England, on confiscated land in Northern Ireland. This was not a casual migration. It was part of a deliberate political and religious restructuring of the region. And among the settlers who moved into Ulster were many people whose background connected, directly or indirectly, to the Scottish Lowlands and border regions. They brought language, religion, farming practices, kin networks, and a deep memory of living in contested landscapes. But Ulster was not simply Scotland transplanted. It was a new and often uneasy world. Here, these settlers encountered another frontier, one shaped not by Anglo-Scottish rivalry, but by colonization, confessional division, land tension, and political uncertainty. They were Protestant in a region with a large native Irish Catholic population. Many were Presbyterian, while the established state church favored Anglican structures. They were settlers, but not always fully trusted by elites. They occupied land, but often under insecure economic conditions. They were powerful in some ways and vulnerable in others. This complexity is one reason Scots-Irish identity can be so hard to explain cleanly. It was never just about blood, it was about layered formation, borderland inheritance, Scottish cultural roots, settlement in Ulster, Protestant religious identity, economic pressure, migration under instability. And over time, these communities became distinct enough that when many later moved to North America, they were recognized as a particular people, not merely generic Scots or generic Irish. Life in Ulster could be difficult. Many tenant farmers faced rising rents, economic uncertainty, limited political power, and periodic religious discrimination, especially because Presbyterians did not enjoy full equality under the Anglican establishment. Add bad harvests, trade restrictions, and demographic pressure, and the result was predictable. Many families began looking westward across the Atlantic. Not because America was easy, it was not. Not because they had no roots, they did, but because frontier-shaped people have often chosen risk over stagnation. That choice would transform the history of early America, the Great Atlantic Crossing. During the 18th century, large numbers of people from Ulster migrated to North America. Historians still debate exact totals and timing in detail, but the larger pattern is clear. The movement was substantial, sustained, and historically consequential. Many landed first in Pennsylvania, especially through Philadelphia and nearby ports. Others entered through places like Delaware, New Jersey, and the Carolinas. But unlike some immigrant groups that remained concentrated near major urban entry points, many of these settlers moved inland with a remarkable speed. That pattern is one of the great signatures of Scots-Irish settlement. They did not simply arrive in America. They pressed toward the edges of settlement, into valleys, into contested interior lands, into rough country where land was cheaper, institutions weaker, and danger often closer. They became heavily associated with the American backcountry, those broad interior zones stretching from Pennsylvania down the Great Valley through Virginia into the Carolinas, Tennessee, Kentucky, and beyond. Why there? Part of the answer was economic. Land near the coast was often already controlled by wealthier elites or established interests. Interior zones offered possibility, however dangerous. Part of the answer was social. Many Scots-Irish migrants were used to community life built around kinship, church, local defense, and practical self-reliance. Frontier settlements demanded exactly those qualities. And part of the answer was cultural memory. People shaped by one unstable frontier may adapt more readily to another. But we should pause here and reject a common oversimplification. The Scots-Irish were not the only people in the backcountry, and the American frontier was never shaped by a single ethnic group. Germans, English settlers, Africans both enslaved and free, indigenous nations, and many others were part of that world. Any honest documentary treatment must say that clearly. What makes the Scots-Irish distinctive is not exclusivity, but influence. In region after region, they became a major demographic and cultural force in the frontier interior. They helped populate some of the most strategically important corridors of colonial expansion, and they carried with them habits of worship, speech, mobility, and local identity that would echo for centuries. By the middle of their American story, something remarkable had happened. A people formed through one set of border experiences in Britain and Ireland had become central actors in a new border world in North America. That transition is one of the reasons the Scots-Irish loom so large in the myth and memory of the American frontier. Faith, discipline, and the Presbyterian backbone. To understand the Scots-Irish in America, you cannot ignore religion. For many of these communities, Presbyterianism was not a side detail. It was a structural force. It shaped how families organized themselves, how communities educated children, how moral life was regulated, how leaders emerged, and how people understood their obligations to both God and neighbor. Presbyterian culture often valued literacy, Bible reading, theological seriousness, and disciplined community life. Churches were not only places of worship, they were anchors of memory, authority, and social continuity, especially in mobile or unstable environments. This mattered enormously on the frontier. Where formal institutions were sparse, congregations became centers of cohesion. Ministers could be educators, mediators, and moral authorities. Churchyards became repositories of lineage. Marriage patterns often followed denominational lines, and congregations sometimes acted as cultural bridges, helping transplanted populations maintain identity across distance and time. At the same time, Scots-Irish religious history in America was not static. Many descendants later became Baptist or Methodist, especially in areas touched by revivalism and the emotional intensity of the Great Awakenings. So by the 19th century, the religious map was more mixed than many people assume, but the Presbyterian backbone remained historically important. Even when denominational labels changed, earlier frameworks of discipline, scriptural seriousness, and covenant-minded community often left a deep imprint, and that imprint could extend beyond theology into politics and public life. Communities shaped by strong local church governance sometimes developed habits of participation, debate, suspicion of imposed authority, and moral seriousness about public questions. Not always, not uniformly, but often enough that historians have long noticed the pattern. This is also where long-term audience trust matters in telling the story. It is tempting to mythologize religion as either the pure source of frontier virtue or the engine of intolerance. The truth is harder and more human. Faith gave many Scots-Irish communities resilience, literacy, structure, and solidarity. It could also sharpen boundaries, exclusions, and conflicts. Both belong in an honest account. And honest accounts are more compelling than flattering ones. Right at the center of this story is a question many families still ask. What did our ancestors actually carry with them that lasted? If this kind of documentary history is your lane, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, because we are about to move from migration into inheritance, from where the Scots-Irish went to what they left behind, from frontier settlers to cultural force. Once in America, Scots-Irish communities became associated with several recurring patterns: frontier farming, militia service, westward mobility, localism, and a reputation, deserved or exaggerated depending on the case, for toughness and independence. This reputation did not emerge from nowhere. Many settlers lived in regions where conflict with native nations, competition over land, imperial rivalries, and weak institutional protection created real insecurity. Frontier life rewarded practical skill, endurance, and readiness. Communities that could organize quickly and defend themselves had advantages. And in that environment, Scots-Irish descended settlers often built identities around courage, kin loyalty, and self-direction. Later, American memory would amplify this into a near-mythic image: the backwoods rifleman, the stubborn homesteader, the uncompromising frontiersman. As always, myth simplifies. Real lives were more varied. Some families prospered, some failed, some moved repeatedly, some assimilated quickly, some stayed poor for generations. Some were deeply pious, some were violent, some were politically engaged, some just wanted land and distance. Still, the broader influence is undeniable. Scots-Irish descended populations played visible roles in frontier settlement patterns, militia traditions, Revolutionary-era mobilization in certain regions, westward migration into the upland south and trans-Appalachian territories, the cultural shaping of Appalachian and southern upland society. Their legacy also appears in more subtle forms: speech rhythms, naming patterns, moral codes, humor, music, storytelling, family structure, suspicion of pretension, pride in endurance, a tendency to define dignity less by polish than by stamina. That last point is worth slowing down for. Many elite traditions define status through refinement, lineage display, urban manners, or institutional prestige. Frontier-derived Scots-Irish culture often leaned the other way. Respect could come from blunt competence, physical courage, labor, Bible knowledge, local loyalty, or the ability to stand firm under pressure. That cultural style did not remain confined to one ethnic stream forever, but the Scots-Irish were one of its major carriers into the American interior. In time, these influences fused with others and became part of a broader regional identity. That is why many people today do not realize they are looking at Scots-Irish inheritance at all. They think they are looking at just Southern culture, or just Appalachian tradition, or just old American stock. In reality, they may be seeing one important strand in a much older braid: the myths, the confusions, and the lost label. If Scots-Irish ancestry was so influential, why do so many descendants not recognize it? One reason is the label problem. Scots-Irish sounds precise, but family history rarely stayed precise. One generation might say Scottish, another might say Irish, another might say Scotch-Irish, another might drop ethnicity almost entirely and identify simply by region, religion, or nationality. Census takers, clergy, neighbors, and descendants all use terms inconsistently. Another reason is assimilation through success and spread. Once Scots-Irish descended families moved deep into American society, their distinct identity often became less visible. They intermarried. They moved west. They changed churches. They stopped talking about Ulster. The Atlantic story compressed. The borderland memory faded, and the surviving clues scattered into fragments. There's also the issue of romantic myth-making. In some retellings, Scots-Irish ancestry becomes a flattering identity badge, shorthand for being tough, freedom-loving, and naturally frontier-minded. In other retellings, it becomes a simplistic explanation for regional conflict, suspicion, or violence. Both approaches flatten history. No ancestry group explains everything. No lineage carries a single personality across centuries. Historical populations are not character types, what their descendants inherited. So what exactly traveled forward? Not just surnames, though surnames matter. Not just DNA, though DNA can help. Not just migration routes, though routes are crucial. What really traveled were patterns. Patterns of settlement in interior corridors, patterns of church life and scriptural seriousness, patterns of marrying within recognizable community networks, patterns of military participation and local defense, patterns of speech and oral memory, patterns of movement when conditions tightened, patterns of pride and self-sufficiency. And these patterns can still be traced today in archives, in graveyards, in land records, in church minutes, in family Bibles, in regional folklore, and sometimes in the emotional logic of family stories themselves. That last part deserves attention. Families do not only pass down names, they pass down scripts, how to think about outsiders, what counts as weakness, when to leave, how to handle conflict, what faith is for, what land means, what honor demands. Those scripts change, soften, and mix over time, but they can endure long after people forget where they came from. So when someone says their family has always been mountain people, or always moved when things got crowded, or always had preachers and soldiers, those may not be random anecdotes. They may be faint modern echoes of a deeper Scots-Irish inheritance. Of course, no serious historian would say cultural memory equals proof of ancestry. It does not, but it can guide the search. The strongest conclusions come from convergence: records, migration patterns, denominational history, surnames, cluster genealogy, and, where useful, DNA matches interpreted carefully rather than magically. And that careful approach is exactly what preserves trust. Viewers can handle complexity. In fact, complexity is often what keeps them watching, if the story is told with confidence, clarity, and genuine stakes. Because the stakes here are not abstract, they are personal. To discover Scots-Irish ancestry is not merely to add a label to a chart. It is to realize your family may be connected to one of the great chain migrations of the Atlantic world, from contested British frontiers to colonial Ulster, to the mountains and valleys of early America. That is not a small reveal. That is a reframe. Conclusion. From border bloodlines to American memory. The Scots-Irish story begins in a hard land between kingdoms. It passes through a hard land between communities. And it reaches America through people already practiced in uncertainty, adaptation, and endurance. They did not arrive as blank slates. They brought memories of border conflict, habits of self-defense, a Protestant religious framework, strong kin structures, and a willingness to gamble on rough country rather than accept constriction. In America, those inherited patterns found a new environment, and in many places, a powerful new destiny. That does not make the Scots-Irish the sole authors of the frontier. They were not. American history is too large, too entangled, and too diverse for that kind of fantasy. But it does make them one of its most important threads, and perhaps that is why their descendants so often sense something unfinished in the family story. A surname that feels half-explained, a migration route that seems too early to be famine Irish, a church tradition that points north, a family temperament shaped by toughness, motion, and memory, a feeling that Irish was true but not the whole truth. Sometimes ancestry is not hidden because the evidence is absent. Sometimes it is hidden because the old categories were too small for the real journey. The Scots-Irish were never just one thing. They were a people, made by borders, remade by migration, and remembered, often without the name, in the frontier character of America itself. If this documentary-style deep dive sharpened how you think about your own roots, subscribe, leave a comment with the surname or region you're tracing, and share this with a family member who keeps the old stories alive. The next clue in your bloodline may not send you to one country, but to a chain of frontiers that changed your family forever.